Anarcho-capitalism is a word that describes something that has nothing to do with anarchy, nor any resemblance to capitalism. It's not anarchy because there are rules, laws. Anarcho-capitalism assumes a legal order as complex as the current one, perhaps even more complex. But there isn't a compulsory, mandatory government. There isn't a monopoly of the legal order. There isn't one unified judicial system. You're free to choose the legal order to which you want to submit yourself. Imagine if, where you live, you could choose out of a set of different governments the one to which you'd like to pay your taxes and to obey its laws. It would be something like that. There is a minimal ethical basis derived from the right to property, freedom, and the principle of non-aggression, but other rules will be added to that common ground. Unless you understand anarchy as the absence of a coercive, mandatory government where no one can initiate violence to make others do something. Because, in that case, anarcho-capitalism is indeed anarchy. But it's not capitalism in the most used sense of the word, that is, the accumulation of capital by power structures. Without a monopolist government, big corporations aligning themselves with politicians to thrive are gone as well. Crony capitalism is not possible if a government needs to be efficient to compete with other governments in a market. Without compulsory rules and entry barriers, all dirty tricks used by corporations to keep monopolies and oligopolies fall apart. Well, unless you understand capitalism as free market and private property. In that case, it is capitalism indeed, since free market and private property are the basis for anarcho-capitalism. Who created anarcho-capitalism? The idea of choosing a group or a person to lead society as a whole is clearly an aggression against everyone in that society, especially those who don't like or don't agree with said group or person. Governments are unethical by definition. Moreover, the society as a whole is more intelligent than any group of people. Even the most skilled, smart, well-intentioned group is not as intelligent as the society taken as a whole. Governments, then, are intrinsically inefficient, and there is a way to let society decide for itself. Praxeology shows it. Private property and capital are the mechanisms of positive feedback created in that social neural network. Each person, acting individually, contributes to the knowledge of the society at large. But how did this idea came about? Anarchy is an old idea. There are records of anarchist ideas and writers back in the 6th century BC in China. Governments have always been unethical and inefficient since the beginning of time, but anarchist ideas gained traction in the 19th century in France with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Not only is modern anarchy against government, but it's also against any hierarchical structure, including, according to some, private property. Proudhon stated that private property is theft because it makes us unequal. However, he can be easily rebutted, because every person owns at least one thing, that is, his or her own body. Other properties someone has, besides his or her body, come out by mixing one's labor with natural resource. Even land owned is defined as use, limitation, and defense. Thus, without mixing it with labor, a given property doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, traditional anarchism never managed to hold as an ideology. Even small anarchist villages and communes that exist throughout the world have actually a form of government. It is not a state in the strict sense of the word, but it is a form of government in which, occasionally, a citizen has to do something against his or her will due purely to coercive pressure from the group. And why does it happen? It happens because traditional anarchism fails to cope with the issue of scarcity. Whereas the amount of natural resources is finite, the demand that people have for them is much higher. As a consequence, in any peaceful society, there should be a non-violent way to allocate finite resources, and by pure logic, there are only three ways to do it. The first one would be through central planning, in which a government, a ruler, or a leader decides who is going to use a given resource. This is what happens in a communist country, and also in most of the communes, hippie villages, and anarchist communities existing nowadays. Yes, and saying that it is an assembly that decides does not change the fact that it is a form of government, as it is a governing body that ultimately establishes the assembly. Another way to solve the problem of scarcity is through private property, in which the first person to use a given resource, mixing his or her own labor to it, marking it off, and defending it, becomes the legitimate owner. The current legitimate owner transfers its property title to someone else in exchange for a compensation. Finally, the problem of scarcity may be solved in a third way, a mixture of the previous two, partly by the government, partly by private property. This is the most common solution nowadays. Governments all over the world use that alternative today. Thanks to that failure in solving scarcity, anarchism has been traditionally confined as a cultural factor, being considered more as an internal revolt against life's hardships than a real viable solution. As a matter of fact, the perfect solution began to be outlined in the 19th century by an Austrian economist named Karl Menger. Menger was the first to refute the labor theory of value, popular at the time, and adopted by Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, among others. The labor theory of value stated that the valuation of a marketable commodity was defined by the value of the inputs and the labor used in its production. According to Menger, however, the value of a commodity is defined by its subjective marginal utility as perceived by the buyer, irrespectively of the amount of labor used to produce it. Nowadays, there is no real questioning about that issue. It is obvious that the value of a commodity is defined by the subjective perception of the buyer and that the labor theory of value was just mistaken. The fact that the labor theory of value was refuted destroyed all other theories by Marx. The surplus value is completely based on the labor theory. Indeed, all ideas that appear on the capital became a big pile of useless paper. On a second thought, a big pile of paper that can be used as toilet paper by Venezuelans, Cubans, and other victims of Marx's ideas. And it's no use saying that Marx also used the term utility and that he believed that value was labor and utility. Because if surplus value was both, then it didn't make any sense. The surplus value theory would be potentially useful only if calculated based on the labor theory. Moreover, value being defined as labor plus utility was also refuted by Menger, who had shown that value is only marginal utility, with no relation to labor whatsoever. But the true revolution came with another Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, with his treatise about human action that established the foundations of praxeology, the deductive study of human action. Since most of the economists that followed this school had Austrian roots, such school of economic thought has been known as the Austrian school. Notice that it doesn't have any relation to the Austrian government, nor to Austria. It's just a reference to the origin of the main economists who founded that school. Praxeology includes a set of methods, axioms, and rules that allow one to deduce all of the economic laws observed in the real world. In fact, praxeology was able to predict correctly the consequences of state intervention in the economy. Besides, in his book about economic calculation, Mises showed the impossibility of a socialist regime, due simply to the inability of calculating the prices of the product. Mises is the maximum exponent of the Austrian school. All important ideas that led to anarcho-capitalism have been set forth by him. Mises, however, was not an anarcho-capitalist simply because the term had not been coined yet. He was a passionate advocate of social and economic freedom and predicted correctly that government is unable to reduce social inequalities or improve living standards of the poor. Friedrich Hayek, another Austrian economist, was the first laureate of the Nobel Prize in Economics coming from the Austrian school. He showed that knowledge is dispersed through society, and a group of people, no matter how wise or well-intentioned, doesn't hold enough knowledge to plan and guide the economy and the society at large. But it was Murray Rothbard, an American economist with Polish and Russian ancestry, disciple of the Austrian school, who finally connected the dots and created anarcho-capitalism. Rothbard had been previously supervised by Mises. Later, he published a book titled Man, Economy, and State, in which he divides state intervention in 3 types and shows how all of them are ultimately detrimental. This book is an addition to Mises's work. The term anarcho-capitalism doesn't appear often in Rothbard's works. Instead, he preferred the term libertarianism in his papers and books. Nevertheless, he considered both terms as synonyms. However, Rothbard himself used many times the term anarcho-capitalism in interviews and lectures, especially after 1950. One may say that anarcho-capitalism was born in 1950 and that Rothbard was its father. But it's a transforming idea that encompasses all methodology of the Austrian School of Economics and presents clear solutions to all aspects of society. There are many authors who were important to anarcho-capitalism. For instance, Friedrich Bastiat, Henry Thoreau, Eugen Boon von Bavik. I will refrain from mentioning all of them here, so to keep the video short. Other renowned economists, such as Hans Hermann Hoppe and Walter Block, have been improving anarcho-capitalist theory. There is still much to be done, but we are on the right track. Society without a state, without coercion, without force, will be our social organization. 30 years from now, when we will all be living in Ancapistan, this will be the history we are going to teach our grandchildren, how we overcame the dark ages of state policy and reached social renaissance, the global Ancapistan. That's it, folks. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to give your thumbs up and share it. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to be notified of new videos. If you'd like to help the channel, become a member by clicking on the Join button below. You will have access to the sponsor's Discord channel, where we talk about the topics and hang out from time to time. See you soon in the following episodes.